Well, okay. So for those of you that are watching, I'm sorry we had hopefully this isn't going to happen again. Um, so, so let's go back to this, and I'll just go back one slide real quick. Part of what I want to get across here is that that part of what a good plan should do is not just provide for your disabled loved one when you pass away, but also provide for them if you were to lose capacity. And as I was introducing here before we crashed here, what I'd like to do is introduce Ed Roberts, and he's actually pretty prominently, he was a mentor of mine, and I was one of many people here who followed Ed. But one of his favorite sayings was that the disability community is a group that that does not discriminate and accept any of us at any time. So I'll give you an example. In my case, with my wife and I, we don't have a child with a disability. Our children are supposedly able to provide for themselves, and I believe it's going to happen one of these days here. But in this case, coming from an institution, I'm pretty terrified of going into an institution myself, and what our estate plan basically says is as long as things don't change, if there's a choice between taking care of myself and my wife and our practice, those are our priorities. And if there's something left for the kids, well, that's terrific, okay? A lot of my clients aren't in a position to really be that cavalier. And the thing you need to look at is, what if you were to become part of the disability community? What if you were to have Alzheimer's or dementia or a physical disability? And part of a good estate plan should really also cover, should give the trustee and who's ever in charge of the trust some indication of, how they should allocate the resources. How much should their focus be on yourself, your loved ones, your disabled child, things that matter to you, and what kind of assistance would you want to continue? So a good estate plan isn't just death planning. It's also planning in the event of your incapacity. Another way to look at this here is, this comes from a book called Loving Trust. It's not a book about special needs trust. It's not even in print any longer, but I've always liked this definition of estate planning. It really covers a philosophy of estate planning. And their definition of good estate planning is, I want to provide for myself and my loved ones during my lifetime, and upon my incapacity or death, give what I have to who I want, the way I want, when I want, and if I can, save every last fee, tax, or court cost possible. Now, most of my clients are focused on the fee part, and I can certainly understand that up here, but part of estate planning really is setting up a system that's going to provide for you and your loved ones and give really clear instructions about what folks are supposed to do. And unless you have unlimited resources, sometimes that really has to focus on what kind of priorities are we talking about. So a little basics about what a special needs trust is. Okay, and a lot of what we're going to focus on is preservation of SSI. Now, even if they're not getting SSI and only getting Medi-Cal, the rules are pretty much the same. So this isn't something that the Social Security Administration came up with thinking, well, wouldn't this be clever and really nice for families? Here, this is something that comes from Social Security law, which says that a resource for SSI is any cash or personal property the SSI recipient owns or has the power to convert into cash, or is not legally restricted from using. So the problem with it for most benefits, SSI, Medi-Cal, whatever, is that a person on those programs can only have $2,000 in resources. Those numbers were set in 1989. If there was even a conservative cost of living increase, that number should be somewhere around $18,000, but the number today still remains here in 2017, $2,000. So the problem is, if you give them too much that they can control, here they'll lose their eligibility for SSI and Medi-Cal. If an SSI recipient does not own an asset outright and is legally restricted from direct access to the funds, those assets are not considered a resource for benefits eligibility. And this is blocked and copied right out of Social Security law. So what a special needs trust is, really, in essence, it's a contract where the trustee, the manager of the trust, has sole and absolute discretion over the assets in the trust, and basically the beneficiary has none. In essence, it's a form of a spendthrift trust. It's a trust where the trustee has absolute discretion and the beneficiary has none. Anybody see a problem with that? Now, for some folks, your objective may be that you really don't want your child controlling the funds because maybe they're unable to do it. But there's lots of folks that are disabled that really do have the ability to do that. And so one of the things with this that you really have to look at is that the beneficiary, your child in most of these cases, will have access to none of the funds. Here, all the decisions will be made through the trustee or the management team. And as we talk about management teams, keep that in mind because there are some situations. Let's assume, for instance, that Kathy, other than her disability and the need to maintain her benefits, is you would prefer that she have some say-so or have some sort of control. This is one of those things with the special needs trust where she can't have complete control, and we might want to design this thing in such a way where it would take into account Kathy's wishes. By directing assets otherwise intended for the disabled individual in a special needs trust, you're preventing those assets from being counted as available resources for benefit purposes. Once again, we work with many families where maybe the objective is for them not to have control, but there's lots of folks with disabilities where, that could actually be a problem. So when you begin planning, your primary objective should be for focusing on the best quality of life possible and use the trust basically as a tool to meet those objectives. The objective is not to keep the SSI here. It's merely a tool, and there may be some situations where maybe preservation of the SSI or Medi-Cal is more harmful than good. Proper planning should focus on achieving as much independence as possible. Benefits shouldn't be the sole objective. Now, this slide here, and you'll notice with a lot of the slides we have here, it has a number on the top that says SI-01120.200B13. What is that number? That is a POMS site, Program Operation Manual System. If you put that into Google, what you'll come up with is a document where I blocked and copied some of the information out of there. Probably it will come up after my web page because we have a lot of information and a lot of the POMs. So when you call Social Security, does it seem like they're reading a script? They're reading a script. Okay, this is telling the eligibility workers how to handle things here. And part of what I want to go through is how is it that the eligibility workers are taught about what is a proper special needs trust and what isn't. So this says that another name for a special needs trust is a supplemental needs trust. It's exactly the same thing. And it's a type of trust that limits the trustee's discretion as to the purpose of distributions. Usually it's to supplement, not supplant. And the type of trust contains language that distributions should be to supplement, not supplant here, and to provide eligibility for government benefits. It describes special needs trusts into two types of special needs trusts. Tonight we're going to focus on third-party or estate planning trust. There is a second kind of trust called the self-settled trust, where it's the disabled person's funds that go into the trust. That's similar, but tonight we're going to cover estate planning trust, or what Social Security calls third-party trust. So once again, here's what Social Security says. A third-party trust is a trust established by someone other than the beneficiary as the grantor, the creator of the trust. For example, a third-party trust could be created by a grandparent for a grandchild. In my case, I have a niece named Erica that we've created a trust for her here, so it could be an aunt and uncle for a niece. It could be a parent for a child. It just can't be the disabled person for themselves. And what the Social Security is saying is to be careful where a trust is allegedly established by a third party, but in reality, it really has the beneficiary's property. Here would be an example. Let's say you set up a Gift to Minors Act account. Okay, let's say when your child was born, all the gifts came in, and you go down to the bank and you ask the bank, what am I supposed to do with these funds? And they say, well, you can set up a custodian account, oftentimes called a Gift to Minors Act account here, and it basically makes you the custodian, but it's the child's funds. Okay, and let's say you'll discover that those funds, when your child turns 18, here, it will keep your child from getting SSI. So you go, I know what I'll do. I'll set up a special needs trust, a third-party trust, and I will put my child's money from the custodian account into the trust. That is what Social Security is looking for. So all the funds that go into a third-party trust need to go directly into the special needs trust and never actually touch the beneficiary. By the way, you can use a third-party trust as a really good tool if people do want to make gifts to your child without interfering with their Medi-Cal or SSI. A third-party trust has great latitude, so you can do all sorts of things with a third-party trust, and you can also make the beneficiary, when they pass away, anyone you like, with one sad exception. You cannot leave it to the drafting attorney because, well, the state bar really frowns on that kind of thing. So you can leave it to other family members, you can leave it to nonprofits, you can leave it to the ARC, you can leave it to NAMI. Here, sadly, you can't leave it to the Dale Law Firm. In Chapter 7, we actually go through what I call the 4-step process. And for that process, the reason we kind of follow this process is that sometimes it seems like setting up a special needs trust could be pretty daunting. But if you approach this kind of in a step-by-step process, it can be a lot less overwhelming. Additionally, the special needs trust is more likely to meet your objective. Okay, so part of, from Chapter 7 on, really kind of it's focusing on what is the process of setting up a special needs trust. And the 4 steps that we focus on is, the first step is going to be to clearly express your intent in your document, in your trust and related documents. After you're done doing that, then we need to select a management team or a management system and team to carry out that intent. You could have a great trust with a great management system, but if you don't put something in that trust, it's not going to do very much at all. So you need to come up with a funding plan to fulfill that intent. And then the last part of the process, and this is pretty much the way the world is when you're trying to provide for a person with a disability, which is your job is never done. Okay, even when you pass away, that whole process needs to be updated and reviewed periodically, not just for your lifetime, but for the lifetime of your child with a disability. And we're going to cover really how that process works. So let's talk about expressing your intent. So, we covered that. So why is documenting your intent so important? And in trust law, all the cases involved, what is the grantor, the creator of the trust, what is it they really wanted to accomplish? Okay, everything is driven by that. One of the primary duties of a trustee is to comply with whatever that intent is. And if you have a bare bones trust, if all it says is keep my kid qualified for SSI and Medi-Cal, they're not going to really have the proper directions that the team needs to carry out their function, and they're going to be left to guess that. Without proper documentation of the intent, the trustee will not be able to understand the grantor's values and objectives. Now, and as we had covered before, part of what we're trying to avoid is situations of isolation and abuse, and because we're running a little behind. So there's a common misperception. Actually, hold on a second. So part of what we're looking to do is clearly state your intent in these documents, so that if in the future a trustee who does not know you is administering the trust, it's going to be clear what it is that's expected of them. A bare bones trust can only accomplish limited objectives. Okay? So, a special needs trust, and the way we do this is in the trust itself, we put in broad language about what it is that you want this trust to do. Okay, and so some of the questions that are asked in the intake sheet are, what kind of living situation are you looking at? Are you looking at them trying to have their own place to live? Are you looking at them living with family? Are you looking at them being in some sort of a group living situation? What kind of living situation are you looking for your child? And what kind of things are you trying to avoid? Without getting into a tremendous amount of detail, you might want to focus on what kind of vocational focus you might want to have for a person, for your loved one. For many of the families we work with, there may be a high priority on them trying to be independent someday and being able to support themselves if it's possible. Social things. You may want to focus on what sort of social activities you want to encourage. And part of this isn't just do they want to play football or do they want to play baseball. Part of this is, you go back to this. The more they're actually involved in the community, the less likely they're to be abused. One thing that often comes up is if faith is something that's important to you, you're not allowed to say that if you don't believe in Jesus, we're not going to make any distributions. That's just not going to work. On the other hand, you can say in the trust that if my child wants to be involved in my church, my synagogue, my temple, whatever, I want to encourage you, trustee, to have my child involved in these things. And here's why. Part of the community movement out of institutions in the community isn't just physically being in the community, it's being part of the community. And the more they're involved, whether it's social clubs or it's institutions of faith or whatever it is, the more they're involved in the community, the less likely they're to be abused and the more full their life is likely to be. And this is coming from somebody who's barely Methodist. Okay, so now with that, we put broad information in the trust, but we don't put a lot of detail with that. With that, you can tie it into we like to call them journals of intent. You can call them letters of intent, but this would be a second document where you can continually add more information about things like what medications work, what don't work, what doctors should they see, what doctors should they involve. A lot of family members have really important information that can be passed on. It also helps give guidance to the trustee about what it is they're to accomplish. Think of the journal as an ongoing documentation of your loved one's needs. This I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on, which is the quest for the ideal trustee. And before I go through this, what I'm going to tell you may surprise you as far as using professional trustees and that kind of thing. What we have found is that by having, in many cases, a trustee system with folks who really understand the different components of what a trust does, the trust is more likely to work than not work. Now, I do a lot of work with folks with mental health issues. I do this program from time to time for NAMI called Why You Shouldn't Make Your Daughter the Trustee of Your Bipolar Son's Special Needs Trust. It's not a good idea. Kind of go through what did she ever do to you here and why sometimes it's very difficult for a sibling to be a trustee over siblings. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't, I haven't seen it work. I'm just saying that in a lot of cases, we see a lot of ill-equipped family members named as trustees to take over some pretty important duties, and oftentimes they're ill-equipped to do that, and we spend a lot of time fixing broken special needs trusts. Part of what we want to focus on is that it may be that whereas, for instance, your daughter, maybe the proper role isn't for her to be the trustee, there are other roles that she can play to make sure that her brother gets the best quality of life. Once again, if it turns out that in your situation it's you feel like your family member that you'd like to name as trustee is equipped to do this, that's certainly what we would do. But what we'd like you to do is keep an open mind, because I want to discuss a couple of models here, and these are not the only models. And part of what I would encourage you to do is sit down with the drafting team, and remember, you're buying their experience. Look at the situation, look at the assets you have in mind, and ask them, what have you seen that works, what doesn't work, and what do you think would work in my situation? And that's part of what good guidance should be. So we've been looking for this character for some time. And as an aside, I am the trustee of the Golden State Pool Trust. I have over 200 beneficiaries that I'm responsible for personally, and I would not make this list, especially when we get to the last thing. Remember, a special needs trust, the trustee has absolute discretion over all distributions, and the beneficiary has virtually none. Okay, we can have situations where they can have intake, and as we talk about these models here, oftentimes it may be that you may want to choose one model over another because it may empower your loved one with a disability more. But for Social Security purposes and for Medi-Cal, What they're looking for is there any way your child can control these funds, and if they can, they won't be eligible for benefits. So the first thing is we need to make sure that the trustee is going to use their discretion in the best interest of the beneficiary. Okay, and a lot of that isn't just whether they're a good person or not a good person. A lot of it is really understanding the disability and a lot of the challenges involved and making some pretty difficult decisions from time to time. They should understand public benefits and keep up with changes in the law. Now, Jennifer and I, and many of the folks here, we spend a lot of time focusing on public benefits. We're very well published, and we spend all day long reading the POMs, reading the regs, and even that, there isn't a week that goes by that we're not stumped about something, because these rules often are very difficult to deal with. It doesn't mean that the trustee has to be totally focused on all the minutia of public benefits, but they need to understand the basics of benefits and know when they need to get help. Okay, and for any of you who have dealt with public benefits, oftentimes if you try to use common sense, you're doomed to fail. Okay, it's really driven a lot by a lot of administrative rules. Someone who can wisely invest and conform to all statutory fiduciary requirements. This is important for a number of reasons. Look at it this way, for lack of a better term. If you have a typical child and a child with a disability, and let's say you decide to split your estate in half. If your child that is not disabled squanders the money away, they normally have more options than your child with a disability. If those funds are invested or put into risky investments and lost, there's virtually no way to get that back. So we need to make sure that somebody's going to do the proper investments here and make sure that, once again, those funds are protected. Somebody who's going to understand taxes. Now, I have a master's in tax, and my focus is taxation of these trusts. You folks are lucky because I don't have time to go through it a lot, but if we can get a good tax result as well as a good advocacy result out of this, the goal is to stretch these funds as far as we can. Keeping perfect books. Social Security is in the process, and Medi-Cal to a lesser degree, of reviewing every special needs trust. And it's incredibly important to be able to make sure that that all the books are kept up to date. And if Social Security reviews that trust, that that we're going to be able to tell them what the trust paid for, how it paid for them, and that it was done in a way that will keep them qualified for their benefits. Somebody who's going to provide advocacy and prevent abuse, okay? And so part of this, as we talk about the team, is to have somebody who is really in touch with the beneficiary on a regular basis, and this really depends on their ability to be a self-advocate for themselves here, and make sure they're not isolated. So we'll be talking about care managers and that sort of thing as we go through this process. But especially for somebody who is vulnerable, making sure they're not isolated and making sure there's somebody that comes and checks on them from time to time, make sure they're getting the right medication, not being over-medicated, getting the attention that they need, that's incredibly important. Now, I might say to you, I can do most of these things, maybe except for you would never want me investing your money because I'm an attorney. Never have an attorney invest money, but I have a financial advisor who does it for my beneficiaries. This is the one I could have a problem with. You got to be immortal. You got to outlive Kathy. Now, I had my Medicare birthday here, meaning I just turned 65. Here, and so if I were taking care of Kathy, there's a pretty good chance that Kathy's going to outlive me. And so, and I'm told by my doctor I'm in good health, but I'm not immortal. So I certainly wouldn't be the ideal trustee. And here's the fact. There is no such thing as the ideal trustee. So what are you going to do? Well, here's a way to look at it, and here's the concept. If you take that list and how you divide it almost doesn't matter. The goal here is to have a checks and balance. So if we take the folks, the things that deal with advocacy, and I would say, for instance, that would deal with the discretion, be able to understand the needs, understanding public benefits, which I see as an advocacy situation, because sometimes the objective here is to make sure that there are some situations where maybe giving up some or all of the benefits is really preferable to trying to preserve them just for the sake of doing it, and really understanding and putting a little sense to this, and also providing that advocacy. The accountability might involve with keeping the books, here, and making sure we have a system that is going to carry forward no matter what's going to happen here. And the financial part might include understanding the investments and taxes. As we set up our checks and balance system, it almost doesn't matter how you put the groups together, but the idea here is that there is no single entity or no single person who can actually do that. And we found that by setting up a checks and balance system, we're more likely to be able to have a successful administration of your trust. As I'm telling you, I'm going to share with you a couple of models here. These are not the only models, and even if you have a situation where you might have a loved one who can manage the trust, oftentimes it's good to have this as a backup, because for some reason or another, they may not be able to do this for the rest of their life. So this first model we use a lot, and I'll just put this all up here. So in this case, we might have a professional trustee. Now that can be a corporate trustee. Here we have a number of banks that we actually work with who excel with special needs trusts, and this is part of what a good special needs trust attorney should be able to do, is identify who are the leading trustees here in your community and available to beneficiaries. It could be a private professional fiduciary. We use a lot of private professional fiduciaries, and in California, we have a private professional fiduciary law, and there's a group called the Professional Fiduciary Association of California with some very fine private professional fiduciaries here. The corporate trustees will tend to charge a percentage, and they'll tend to have minimums. A minimum, I know of very few corporate trustees that will take less than $500 million, and many want more. Private professional fiduciaries will tend to charge hourly, but there's a number of different factors with that. With that, we might have an advisory committee. So what an advisory committee would be family and friends, and this is where family might be involved. What their job would be to oversee the trustee. In the last chapter, we talk about distribution plans. So a lot of the trustees we work with, what they'd like to do is set up an annual budget. They'll work through the advisory committee, make sure that everybody's fine with it, and then they'll spend the rest of the year carrying that out. The other job of the advisory committee is if they don't feel like the trustee is serving the beneficiary well, we're going to give them the ability to hire and fire the trustee. And that could be for any number of reasons. You might even have a trustee who's doing a very good job, but one thing that we're seeing in the special needs trust industry is that we're seeing new options all the time coming up to deal with that issue that families are dealing with, which is who's going to provide for my disabled loved one when I'm not around. And once again, and right now, we're seeing all sorts of different models that are coming up. So there might be a trustee or a trustee group that comes up later that would do a better job for less money. Why would we not want that? So that's oftentimes the function of the advisory committee. We might tie that with a care manager. What a care manager is, most care managers focus on seniors, but for instance, a lot of care management groups which are made up of social workers, marriage and family counselors. These are basically private social workers, and many of them have experience with developmental disabilities, mental health disabilities, and physical disabilities. I will tell you, within the Golden State Pool Trust, we hire lots of care managers who do incredible work to make sure that our beneficiaries are not only having their day-to-day needs met, but making sure that they're getting the proper medical care, that they're not over-medicated, that they're, that really gives that advocacy to make sure that they're not abused. I will tell you, these folks are worth their weight in gold. This is the first model we'll talk about here, where in this model, basically we're hitting all the different requirements of the professional trustee. And the other thing that I did leave out is the advisory committee would be given the ability to amend the trust if laws change. So let's say in the future there came up with something that with some sort of benefit that says, well, if you don't have this clause in the trust, you won't get this benefit, or that you need to make some sort of change. The advisory committee would have some mechanism to be able to authorize to amend the trust so it could adjust. We go back to this with Kathy. You could expect over 70 years, laws and systems are going to change dramatically, and we need to make sure that this trust is going to be adjusted to things that we may not even be able to imagine in the future. A variation of this, and we use this a lot for folks with mental health issues or intense medical issues. We have the same situation. We may have the trustee managing the trust with the care manager directing much of the care, but with a trust protector, usually a single person, where we're going to give them hiring and firing and ability and the ability to amend the trust. The reason we do this is, like, for instance, some of our more difficult mental health cases, if we make a family member, if we go back to making the sister the trustee, here she's on the front line, and what often happens is that she'll be badgered here, or there'll be a lot of pressure. And if you think about it, it's really kind of a natural for one sibling to be in charge of another sibling to begin with. Here, in this case, the trust protector, we're going to limit them to hiring and firing, so that once again we can try to keep the beneficiary focused on working with the trustee and the care manager. But if you think about it, if they have the ability to hire and fire, they have an enormous amount of power over the trust. Once again, I have a lot of faith in the trustee groups we work with, but long term, my job is to trust nobody. And I have seen very good trustee, corporate trustees do a fantastic job, but over time, management changes. And you know, the trustees or the trustee organizations are only as good as the people that serve them. Now, let's say, and one of the things when you're talking to the drafting staff, you probably want to ask is, like, these are my objectives for my child. And as you start talking about management systems, you want to ask, is this practical and have you seen this work? Now, in a lot of cases, you probably want to have, for a corporate trustee, a minimum of $500,000. You might want to have, if you have more, that's terrific, but not everybody has that kind of money. For a private professional trustee, they certainly will handle and do a good job with lower amounts as well as larger amounts. Let's say you would love to leave a couple $100,000 to your child, but the fact is you're just not able to do that. You're not insurable, you just don't have the resources, and we kind of have to work with what we've got. And let's say we see this all the time. Let's say what the biggest focus we see for folks with disabilities is housing, second to nothing. Where my child will live is almost always the largest issue that we deal with. So let's say that you're able to leave them the use of the house or whatever for a period of time, and maybe only $100,000 or so to make sure that the house is maintained. In that case, we might take a look at using family members as trustee, but really kind of limit the focus of what the trustee is to do. Because the problem we have, especially when you're dealing with housing, is that if you don't have the resources to make sure that that house is taken care of, you're going to lose the house. We probably evict about 4 persons with disabilities a year from their housing. I will tell you, it is an incredibly unpleasant thing to do. But the problem with it is you need to make sure that the plan is viable here. And in a case like that, as much as you would love to send your child to Disneyland on a regular basis, making sure the roof doesn't fall on their head is probably somewhat more important. Now, here's another possibility, which is this. Is a pooled trust directed by a trust advisory committee. Now, the guide goes into this a bit, but what a pooled trust is, it's kind of like a cross between a 401k and a special needs trust. The normal way of using a pooled trust, and once again, I am the trustee of the Golden State Pooled Trust, and even for if you wanted to use them, it's something you might want to think about, because here's why. Options and choices are incredibly important when you're doing these kind of planning. You really don't want to lock yourself into a corner. The traditional way of using a pooled trust, which is to sign what's called a Joinder Agreement. It's a contract, which basically says that I leave the funds to the trust to take care of my child to perform these duties. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but you go back to that is whether it's a pooled trust, a corporate trustee, a private fiduciary, whatever, it's only as good as the people or the organization that's behind it. So the problem with it is, what if the trust isn't really serving the needs of Kathy? Do we have some sort of mechanism to change that? So what we like to do is we like to set up a special needs trust and have the pooled trust manage the separate trust but not use a joinder agreement, because the problem with the joinder agreement is normally there's no way to move it from one fund to another. So the pooled trust manages the funds, makes the distributions, does the taxes, does all the things that a trustee normally does. And usually they'll take very much smaller amounts as well as large. Pooled trusts share resources between hundreds, sometimes thousands of families here. So by pooling the funds together, it's kind of the wholesale way of providing for this. Is kind of the, the previous systems I introduced to you. I kind of think of those as the retail model, so you're paying retail for each piece. The pool trust oftentimes is kind of the wholesale model, because what they're doing is they're sharing resources between hundreds, sometimes thousands of folks. So for instance, their care management costs may be dramatically less depending on the trust. They can include care managers or advocates, often at a lower than the normal cost. Ideally, the pooled trust should be accountable to some sort of support. So here's what we like to do with these things is we would make an advisory committee that would still oversee the trust, and if they did not feel that the pooled trust was doing the job, they would have the authority to yank it and put it with another pooled trust, private fiduciary, or corporate trustee. Here's kind of the thing. We don't know what the future is going to be, and you want to leave your options open as much as you possibly can, because there's so many things that are so unpredictable, and the objective should be, once again, trying to provide quality of life. So, that's kind of an introduction to management systems here. And as I told you, it doesn't mean you can't use family members, but part of what you need to look at is really look at all the different options and try to figure out what's best for you. Now, you could have a great trust that really lays out what the objective is and what the trust is supposed to do. You could have great trustees that are able to do the job, but if you don't put some funds in the trust, it's not going to go very far at all. Another way to look at that is consider the trust as a vehicle, the trustee as the driver, but we've got to put some fuel in this thing or it's not going to go. So with that, if you have a financial advisor you work with, that's an important person to have as part of the team, because oftentimes they'll work with us as we put the trust together and kind of assist on what kind of resources do we have. Do we have investments? Do we have real estate? Do we have retirement plans? What are we going to be able to tap into? Sometimes life insurance can be a really good way to fund these things as well. The other thing is, if you're working with a financial advisor, is that you need to make sure that everything that is dedicated to that special needs trust makes the trust either the beneficiary or the trust as the owner of those assets. If for some reason, let's say you buy a life insurance policy, but you name the person with the disability directly, then that will go to them directly and it won't be able to go in the special needs trust. And in some cases, especially if your child doesn't have capacity, it'll have to go into a different kind of special needs trust that's managed by the courts. And I'm here to tell you, if you can avoid having your things managed by attorneys and judges, you're probably better off, and even the attorneys and judges will tell you that. Okay, so part of that is having a proper funding plan, and make sure that within what you have, what you're doing is practical. The last thing that I'll cover, and then I can take some questions here, is updating and reviewing the trust. Going back to this, we don't know what the future is for Kathy, and we need to make sure that the trust is is practical. Now, on our YouTube channel, we actually have a video on an annual review we suggest you do on updating your special needs trust and updating your living trust. But a question I often hear is, how often should have my child special needs trust reviewed by an attorney? And I'll give you the typical answer: it depends. Okay, because attorneys, their job is to never give you a straight answer. So so I want to follow my training. But how this goes is, it's not once a year, it's not every 5 years. It really depends on the situation here. But what I want to show you is a couple of guidelines to look at, because we don't want to review your trust every year. You don't want us to review your trust every year, because we have a nasty habit of charging for it. But there are some questions that you really should go through periodically, even annually, and do this review. And then that will tell you when you need to actually have it reviewed. Now, in the book, in the guide, and all that, there's actually an article in the Special Needs Alliance website, and this is Alliance Special Needs Trust. I'd say maybe every 7 to 10 years. It's not something we do on a regular basis. There hasn't been a major change in Social Security law in quite a bit of time. Anyway, at that point, I think this is the part of the formal presentation. So here, you made it just at the end here. And we actually have a webinar that didn't crash 3 times that's up on the website. So anyway, does anybody have any questions here? And DJ, you're going to take a shot at trying to get this up?
We're up.
Oh, well, you're doing a good job.
I don't have the screen on the computer, but we're up, and we can take questions online too. I'm on the live chat.
Okay, so for those of you that are watching who haven't left in frustration, DJ is here. My assistant is actually taking questions, and we could do this for another 15-20 minutes. So anybody have a question, or if not, yes.
How absolute is that $2,000 limit? It's like, let's say the mother of the beneficiary, the person with the special need, wanted to leave, to pass on the wedding ring, okay?
Yeah.
But the wedding ring is either somewhere around $2,000 or more. Is that considered that property limit?
So let's cover resources real quick, okay? And one of the things is, if you go to our YouTube channel, it'll have something on benefits, but let's go through this. The resources a person can have on SSI or Medi-Cal is, you can have no more than $2,000 in cash at the first moment of the first day of the calendar month. You can also have any amount of resources here. So, and a lot of this I'm going to tell you doesn't make any sense at all. So they can have big screen TV sets and all of that thing. Let's look at the wedding ring. You can have jewelry as long as you're not holding it for its intrinsic value and you're using it, okay? So one of the things is, if it's something that the child wears from time to time, that's probably fine. They can have an automobile of any value, although maintaining that automobile on the $895 a month they get from SSI is somewhat of a challenge. Here, they can own a residence of any value. And we have a whole playlist on videos having to do with residences, because as we had talked about during the webinar here, housing, I think, is the biggest issue we deal with. We actually suggest you should rarely leave the house in their name. You should leave it in trust for a whole bunch of different reasons. They can own a burial plot of any amount, but they can only set aside $1,500 of their own money to get into the account. So there are resources beyond that. If you go back to the $2,000 in resources, here's the normal thing that happens. It's a snapshot on the first moment of the first day of the calendar month here. And so here's how it goes. Let's say that there's $1,900 on the account on the first day of the month. Social Security checks, whether it's disability or SSI, are actually timed not to hit the account until after the first moment of the first day of the calendar month. So maybe that bounces it up to like $2,600 or whatever the number is. That's fine as long as it's spent down below $2,000 by the next calendar month. It's a very severe rule here. It's a ridiculous number in 2017. It's still the number. Does that help? Yes.
I got a question from the live chat. Generally speaking, should ABLE accounts be considered as a part of a special needs trust in lieu of one or as a complement to one?
So the question's about special needs trust. Now, for those of you in the audience here, and we'll make sure that for those of you that signed up with Ellen, you have a green sheet on a thing called the ABLE Act, which is going to look really strange because green is the green screen color. And that has all sorts of videos about the ABLE Act. Let me just go through what the ABLE Act is really quickly. If your child can show they were disabled before the age of 26, they can qualify for an ABLE account. An ABLE account is a form of a 529 plan specifically created for persons with disabilities. You can put up to $14,000 a year into an ABLE account and still stay qualified for Medi-Cal or SSI. This could be family members, it could be the person with the disability themselves, it could be a special needs trust. Okay, there's a number of things with an ABLE account, one of which is with the ABLE account, when the beneficiary passes away, there's a lien for any Medi-Cal they've used during their lifetime. The Special Needs Trust has no lien. One of the things that we're starting to do with ABLE accounts, as we were talking about, is that one of the things about a Special Needs Trust is that basically the trustee has absolute discretion over every distribution. So if the beneficiary feels it's okay, they can pay, directly for rent. They can pay directly for putting gasoline in the vehicle. They can pay for almost anything as long as they can pay directly for it, but it's in the trustee's discretion. But on the other hand, let's say you have a child with who is perfectly capable of managing things but needs to keep their SSI, Medi-Cal, and IHSS. One of the values of an ABLE account is that you can fund this thing and they can control it themselves here and be able to make certain distributions for themselves and be able to use it for almost anything without having to ask permission. The good thing about an ABLE account is the beneficiary has complete control over the ABLE account. The problem with an ABLE account is the beneficiary has complete control over the ABLE account. You follow what I'm saying here? In a way, tying the two things together can be the best of both worlds. We'll go back to my niece Erica, actually your cousin, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, we're very much into nepotism here at the Dale Law Firm. So DJ here, who is our technical person here, is my nephew. So back to our nepotism. My niece, we opened up an ABLE account for her so that she could have some funds to do with as she wishes. She has Down syndrome. She's a very capable and she's a very opinionated gal. Setting money aside for her in an ABLE account is fine. Would I be comfortable with her having access to $14,000? Absolutely not. Okay, because she probably would be subject to somebody taking advantage of her, that kind of thing. She has a lot of strengths. Managing money isn't her strength. And so in a case like that, it's nice to be able to feed the thing as she needs it. And she's been able to do things she's never been able to do, which is like go out and buy things herself. Because she's on SSI and that kind of thing. Tying the two things together in most cases is the best of both worlds because a third-party trust has no lien. An ABLE account is really good for people that work. We go back to the $2,000 resource limit. And by the way, working is a good thing for a person with a disability, with very few exceptions. Okay? The problem is, if you work, you keep going over that $2,000 resource limit. So the really cool thing is you can work and take whatever excess income you have that would push you over the 2,000 limit and put it in the ABLE account and save it for something later. It also has some special benefits with housing. I'll just say, like everything with disability, I don't know anything simple when it comes to disability. I mean, it's always complicated. There's always a lot of factors to take into account. What we try to do here and what we try to do with our YouTube channel really is to try to lay out the information so people can educate themselves and really make the right decision. There may be situations where an ABLE account would be a substitute for a special needs trust, but really what you need to look at is control, because unless your child is absolutely unable to manage things, and we'll go back to Erica. Erica probably couldn't add up a column of numbers. Can she express her opinion? Jesus, DJ, there's times when I wish she would not express her opinion, right? Because like anybody, any other niece here, she certainly does have capacity here, and so the problem with it is if the thing builds up and she demands to be in charge, she's in charge of this thing. So you really need to look at capacity. You need to look at the lien. You need to look at control. And there's a special thing with housing where it really has a benefit. So, like everything else, should you do an ABLE Act? Should you do a special needs trust? Should you do both? And the answer is, it depends. So if I gave you a clear answer, I blew it. Since you came in late, we'll give you a first shot.
All right. Steve, a couple of questions. On the ABLE account, you mentioned $14,000. Is that per donor or
No.
is that an aggregate?
Unlike a normal 529 plan, and the question was, were you able to pick that up?
Yeah.
The question was, that's an amazing microphone. The question was here, is it 14,000 per donor? Can you do multiple, like in a normal 529 plan, you can have multiple donors, and that's not a problem. In this case, it's 14,000 period, end of game. It's tied to the gift tax exclusion, has nothing to do with gift taxes here. And so eventually it'll go up to 15,000. There's a cost of living increase, but right now it's 14,000. That's what it is.
Is there a cap on the account for SSI purposes?
For SSI purposes, there's a cap that if you go over $100,000, the SSI goes into suspension. And as long as you follow the other rules, when it drops below 100,000, then the SSI turns back on without having to reapply. Now, here's the thing that comes up, and this is where sometimes having a benefits analysis helps. For most folks who are, these numbers get a little wonky. If your child was disabled before the age of 22, so for instance, if you have a child with a developmental disability, by definition is before the age of 18, that's not going to be a problem. When the parent dies, retires, or becomes disabled themselves, your child in most cases is going to go on a program called Childhood Disability Benefits and won't be on SSI anyway. So let's say you start the account here when the child is, let's say for instance, 50, and you retire at 65. Well, when you retire, your child won't be on SSI anyway. They'll be on a different program. So it may be, which by the way is a much friendlier program. Any program is friendlier than SSI, okay? Any of them, right? It really depends on the situation. The problem you run into is like with mental health, it may or may not have started before the age of 22. It really depends on facts and circumstances, and that may not work. So the cap for SSI is $100,000, and I'm just here to tell you, many of the families we work with, by the time you go over that amount, they won't be on SSI anyway. The other cap is, and they keep their Medi-Cal and their IHSS, and the upper cap is whatever that state's 529 plan cap is, which is usually somewhere over $400,000. So I, for instance, will never see an ABLE account that's going to hit the maximum because I doubt if I'm going to live that long. That would be a lot of $14,000 contributions. The thing you also have to remember, and the laws may change on this, is there's a lien for any Medi-Cal the beneficiaries used when they pass away. Okay, and so right now there may be a change in California law on that. There may not be, but that's the law as it stands today. So that's one of these things, like everything else with disability. You got to stay on top of these things because the rules are constantly changing. That's the fascinating and the irritating thing about this work. You had a question, sir?
Yes, is the option now to change? You mentioned something like that. When the person gets Social Security, the child changes from this SSI to
Childhood disability benefits. Here's how this goes. You know how you get that thing for Social Security that says if we don't go broke, this is what we think you're going to get here. So let's say what it says is when you retire, you should be getting. Let's make the numbers easy. Let's say $1,500. Okay, when you retire, if your child was disabled before the age of 22, they'll get an amount equal to half that. Okay, which would be $750. Okay, in fact, let's change the numbers. Let's say the number is that you're going to retire and get $2,000, just to make it easy on me. Your child would get $1,000 a month of Social Security, of what's called childhood disability benefits, and 2 years later they would get Medicare. Okay, and they'd still get to keep their Medi-Cal. Would completely wipe out the SSI. When you pass away, your child would get 3/4 of that, so they would get $1,500 a month. And when you're used to living on $900 and change, $1,500 a month is a ton of money. Okay, I mean, I own a sailboat, so I can blow through that in a weekend, no problem. Here, but you know that, so they would get those funds, and there's less restrictions as far as staying qualified for those programs. What you have to look at is a lot of times. If they continue to need Medi-Cal. So for instance, if they're getting regional center benefits or they're getting attendant care benefits or long-term care benefits, you need to continue the Medi-Cal. So we still have to deal with the $2,000 resource rule. I'd ask you if that makes sense, but most of the stuff doesn't make sense. It's just how it works. If you have a question about that, really, once again, I would suggest you look at the YouTube channel on our benefits thing, or the other thing in the book. I believe it's in chapter 4. Yep, in chapter 4 it goes through that as well with examples.
Is it automatic happens or
It's
like I have to go on and
if
apply for
if
that?
there's any eligibility workers watching tonight, I apologize for what I'm going to say. Social Security is one of the, is there any eligibility workers before I say this? Because I'm going to say it anyway. It's one of the worst run administrative agencies, if not on this planet, definitely in this country. And it's not because they don't care and they're not trying. They're horribly underfunded. Yes, they're supposed to automatically do it. I don't think there's a month that goes by that we don't identify a situation where they should be getting it and they're not getting it, you know. And so if it turns out that, you know, for instance, if your child has a developmental disability, by definition, it's before the age of 18. The math is not hard to do. And if you are getting Social Security and your child's not on childhood disability benefits, I would check why, okay? You'd find this shocking. Social Security often makes mistakes.
Every month.
No, no, but you mentioned also that he wouldn't lose the medical or the.
He won't lose the Medi-Cal as long as he doesn't have more than $2,000 in resources and that kind of thing.
They did tell me that he was gonna change. He was gonna be under my umbrella, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But it never happened.
Well, there's a whole ton of reasons, and especially since I promised my wife I'd be home on time, which I never do. We're not going to go through it tonight, but there's a ton of reasons why you should check into it. It's a much friendlier program, and once they're on the program, it's very difficult to goof up. You really would have to work hard. SSI, you can goof up, no problem, right? Question, sir?
Just a quick piggyback on that. So if I pass away at 80, my daughter's 40 when I pass away, she's going to go from half to 3/4 of what mine was, and let's say, God willing, she lives to be 110, the Social Security will be here until she's 110.
Well, there, yeah.
It's supposed to end the year that I turned 70, so,
Right.
Anyway, she hypothetically would be receiving that with cost of living increases until she's 110.
She would. You could hear that.
Okay.
Now, here's another question that comes up. She probably has a mother. I don't know. Is oh, I thought maybe that's the sister. But anyway, no. Okay. So, what happens when mom retires, passes away? You get whichever gets you the most. You don't get to add them together. It's not that good. So,
She's a school
which
teacher,
other
so
number?
she's in a
Yeah,
different
I'm a teacher,
Oh,
so I
and you
get
have
Cal-
stirs.
She has
Yeah,
CalSTRS.
Oh, I'm sorry. Here, so. By the way, CalSTRS actually just made some positive changes for special needs trusts, and I believe now you can actually direct some of the CalSTRS
Yeah.
funds,
They can,
which you
actually.
couldn't
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
before.
Yeah, no, it's actually
Okay.
changed very well.
Yes, yeah. Well, they were kind of on the
Social
naughty
Security.
list for a long time,
Yeah.
but we can put them on the nice list, right?
So,
If you have a CalSTRS worker who understands the law, which they're not as bad as Social Security, but which we love CalSTRS and PERS and all that. But anyway, actually, we've seen all the different benefit programs over time. 20 years ago, you couldn't direct any of those funds into special needs trust, and we've seen military pensions. Now you can do it. We've seen UC Berkeley. CalSTRS is now one of the last. PERS changed over, and this is part of when you're funding to make sure that that you make the right elections. And there's specialists with each of these groups that'll help you. One last question, and then I'm calling it a night because there's a glass of Chardonnay waiting for me at home. Any last questions or whatever? Okay.
I do.
Okay, there we go. Go for it.
Just pretending, for as a sample, the model number one. When we establish the trust, those fees, everyone, we have to pay some fees, right? They require some fees, and it's going to be an ongoing basis.
Yes.
Those fees won't start until the actual happens, right? Until I die, and then it's going to start
So-
executing the trust or whatever.
Yeah. Well, let me answer that, and I'll give it one step further. So we're talking about different models when we're using professional trustees, and let's say model one, or model 1 or 2, or
Uh-huh.
whatever. If we're using like a corporate trustee here, yes, they do charge. So there's two things. They don't charge until you put the funds in the trust, but I'll go one step further. In most cases, you don't put funds in the trust until you pass away, unless there's an asset protection reason to do it or a tax reason to do it. Okay, and especially with today's estate tax laws, here we're seeing fewer and fewer situations. Now, just to give you some, so in most cases, the trust is not funded until you pass away. Although oftentimes we'll write in your living trust that if you were to lose capacity, we want the trustee to follow the guidelines, but we don't want to fully fund the trust until you pass away. Where's an exception? There are some tax reasons why it might make a lot of sense to fund the trust early. So let's say you have a business and it's just producing a lot of money, more than you can handle, and if it does, well, I'm proud of you here. You're obviously not running a law firm here, but let's say you have a business and you have a partnership. We have many trusts where you can put a piece of a partnership interest, for instance, in the special needs trust. It's generating income, and you can have that income from the trust pay for, let's say your child has lots of attendant care needs. They can turn around and pay the attendant, often with taxable dollars. Okay, so let's do an analysis. If the trustee, and let's say just for sake of argument, the partnership interest produces $20,000 of ordinary income. Okay, and let's say that the trustee pays $30,000 of attendant care costs. Okay, so when the trustee pays those attendant care costs, there's a thing called distributable net income. Think of the trust as a bucket. Think of it as like, nobody remembers this, cream, and the ordinary income is the top layer. And so you always pay the income first. So we're paying the caregivers here are the $30,000 in my example, of which $20,000 of that is taxable income. So we got to ask ourselves, for benefits purposes, did your child get benefits income? Well, benefits income is any cash you give your child. How much cash did you give her? 0. You paid the attendant. Taxable income is any benefit you got to the extent that the payment was taxable. Did she get taxable income? Absolutely. She got $20,000 of taxable income. And here's what happens. Most of that's going to be tax deductible because it's attendant care. The other thing is, in this case, in this example, your daughter's in a lower tax bracket, so she paid lower taxes anyway. And on top of that, the trust comes with what's called a qualified disability trust exemption, which is a $4,000 exemption. Here's the takeaway. 90% of the cases we don't fund it until one parent or the second parent passes away, unless there's a reason to do it for taxes. And this is part of why you want to have this thing set up in a way to take advantage of that. And that's kind of an example where you can actually use these trusts as a tax vehicle if you got more income than you can handle and you have some assets you're willing to give up. Yeah, well, yeah, and I'm a little bit of a tightwad, so I'm not giving it up till I'm gone. But, you know.
So then the trust is just the fee that you...
And at that point, the trustee's going to take a fee, I guarantee you.
Yeah.
But usually the fee is not
To
paid
set up the trust, it's just the fee, the original trust.
for the administration.
Created, and then maybe every year or every 5 years or 10 years, it changes, and that's it. And
So we normally don't fund the trust 90% of the time until one or both of the parents pass away. That's where the fees start. But then here's the other thing that comes up. We normally would say, let's say we decide we want to use ABC Trust Company, local trust company. So what we would normally do is name the trust company as the trustee, or a private professional fiduciary, corporate trustee, or pooled trust of the trust advisory committee's choosing. Why do we do that? I have no idea when you're going to die, nor do you here. And ABC Trust Company may be the absolute right choice in 2017. How do I know the right choice in 2037? Right? There's no way of knowing, and anybody who tells you that is just not being honest with you. So one of the jobs of the advisory committee is to look at this and look at the fees and look at the services and try to make a good business decision. You don't have to necessarily be a benefits expert to do that. Oftentimes you want to have people on your advisory committee who have good business sense. Here, administering these trusts come with an expense, and to try to avoid all the expenses is just not reasonable. But on the other hand, the more you can dedicate to your child, the better off their life will be. So if you go back to this hopefully that kind of illustrates that everything changes. My favorite trustee was Sanwa Bank 20 years ago. Everything went to Sanwa Bank. There is no Sanwa Bank. They went out of business. They changed. We used to do a lot of work with A.G. Edwards because A.G. Edwards was around for 180 years. They will always be here. Whoops, that didn't work out too well either. You know, in today's world, we don't know what the future is going to be. And the thing with these trusts is whether your child is likely to live 70 years or 20 years, that's a long period of time. So you need to make sure you have something that's flexible that'll deal with it. And also, as far as the fees go, fees change wildly from one organization to another over time. Local favorite community bank here used to take special needs trust at $250,000. Then they jumped up to $2 million. Then they jumped down to $1 million. You have people that have named that trust company figuring that their minimums will always be the same. And what happens is that if you don't have that flexibility when it's time to name somebody, the trust won't work because the trustee won't accept it, and now you have to go through and modify it. By using the system we're talking about that basically says, choose a placeholder. You know, this is part of it. When you sit down with Jennifer and her team, if you work with us, ask her, who do you think is the right trustee in this situation? Will that be the right trustee in 20 years? She'll tell you she has no idea.
Exactly.
I have no idea. That's why you would name ABC Bank or a private fiduciary, corporate trustee, or pooled trust of the advisory committee's choosing. See how it works?
So what happened if, let's say we set up with ABC company?
Yeah.
And then I passed. And we didn't change it. It was no time to change
Then
it.
the advisory committee
but
would.
the ABC company doesn't exist anymore. Adam.
Well, then the advisory committee would choose somebody else.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Because that could very well happen. What if they name San Juan Bank?
Yeah. So that tell me that there is always in the trust that is going to be some fees to maintain the trust alive. In other words, kind of.
Usually not till you die. I'm sure if you send a check to the trust company, they take it, but they don't charge fees until there's money in the bank. No, they probably wouldn't take it either. Well, you never know in today's world. Anyway, with that, it is happy hour for me. I'm going home. Thank you very much. For
Thank
those of
you.
you that are on YouTube, I am really sorry. We will try not to crash next time. Okay? Thank you very much. And I'll be around for a few minutes while we shut this down, but